The wrong choice can ruin a life, or reveal the only heart that was ever worthy of yours. Rain hammered against the cracked glass roof of Bellamy Glasshouse Estate, turning the once famous Rose Conservatory into a cathedral of silver streaks and broken reflections. Every gust of autumn wind rattled the aging iron framework above, echoing through the grand ballroom where crystal chandeliers still glowed with stubborn elegance despite the slow decay creeping into every corner of the estate. Audrey Bellamy stood at the center of the room in a pale ivory gown that had belonged to her grandmother, its timeless beauty unable to hide the weight pressing upon her shoulders. Around her, wealthy guests whispered behind polished smiles while servants carried silver trays between towering flower arrangements that could no longer disguise the financial ruin hanging over the Bellamy family. At the far end of the ballroom, Lady Beatrice Bellamy lifted a crystal glass, silencing every conversation with nothing more than her commanding posture. "My friends," she announced with practiced grace, "today we celebrate not only the future of this family but the union that will restore everything generations of Bellamys have built." Polite applause followed as Lord Malcolm Sterling stepped forward, every inch the gentleman's society admired. His tailored black coat fit perfectly. His smile was flawless. His confidence filled the room like expensive perfume. Yet Audrey felt nothing except a familiar heaviness settling deeper inside her chest. She had watched Malcolm charm governors, judges, and businessmen, but she had also seen the coldness hidden behind those polished manners whenever servants accidentally crossed his path or struggling tenant families begged for another week before paying rent. No one else seemed to notice. Or perhaps no one wished to. Lady Beatrice extended her hand toward Malcolm with visible satisfaction before turning to her daughter. "Come forward, Audrey." The room waited. Audrey remained still. Outside, thunder rolled across the Hudson Valley, shaking the old windows. "You have delayed this long enough," her mother said quietly, though every guest heard every word. "This engagement secures our future. There is nothing left to discuss." Audrey finally raised her eyes. "There has never been anything to discuss because you never intended to hear my answer." A ripple of uncomfortable silence swept through the ballroom. Lady Beatrice's expression never changed. "A woman's feelings do not preserve an estate. Good decisions do." Malcolm offered a patient smile that looked rehearsed. "Miss Bellamy, I understand this may seem sudden." Audrey looked directly at him. "Nothing about this feels sudden. It has been decided for me since before anyone thought to ask whether I wished to marry at all." Her mother's voice sharpened. "Enough." The single word landed harder than the thunder outside. "You will marry Lord Sterling because this family has sacrificed everything to protect your future. You will not throw it away over childish fantasies." Audrey slowly looked around the ballroom. Every elegant face avoided meeting her eyes. Every polite smile carried silent approval. Every guest had already accepted a future she had never chosen. Then her gaze drifted beyond the towering entrance doors left slightly open for arriving carriages. Rain poured across the stone courtyard. Beneath the twisted branches of an ancient elm, a gentleman in a dark, worn Victorian coat, an old undershirt, a frayed white shirt, mud-stained trousers, and slightly torn leather boots stood. His disheveled black hair suggested he owned nothing. A servant approached the stranger, clearly attempting to send him away before the celebration continued. The man simply nodded, lifted his bag without protest, and prepared to leave. Something inside Audrey broke free. She stepped away from Malcolm. Gasps followed immediately. Lady Beatrice reached for her daughter's arm, but Audrey moved beyond her grasp and walked through the massive doors into the cold rain. Guests hurried after her beneath umbrellas while servants froze in confusion. The stranger looked up as Audrey stopped only a few feet away. His gray eyes were calm, steady, and strangely impossible to read. They were not the frightened eyes of a man accustomed to begging. They carried the quiet restraint of someone who had learned long ago that true strength never needed to announce itself. Rain soaked Audrey's hair as she faced him. "Sir?" she asked gently. "What is your name?" The man hesitated only a heartbeat. "Caleb Rowan." Audrey nodded once before turning back toward the horrified crowd gathering beneath the estate's marble entrance. Her voice remained soft, yet every person heard it above the rain. "If marriage is nothing more than a choice made for survival," she said, "then I choose the man who owns nothing instead of the one who believes he owns me." The courtyard fell silent. Lady Beatrice's face drained of color. Malcolm stared in stunned disbelief. Caleb Rowan looked at Audrey as though the world itself had shifted beneath his feet, because the woman standing before him had unknowingly offered her future to the last man she was ever supposed to choose. The silence lingered so completely that even the rain seemed to hesitate before striking the ancient stone courtyard again. Lady Beatrice Bellamy stared at her daughter, as though she no longer recognized the young woman she had spent 24 years molding into perfect obedience. Lord Malcolm Sterling slowly lowered the silver-tipped cane resting in his hand, his carefully polished smile dissolving into something colder. Every guest stood frozen beneath umbrellas while servants exchanged anxious glances, uncertain whether they should escort the stranger away or pretend none of this had happened. Caleb Rowan remained standing, his face blank with thought. He had crossed countless towns wearing the same weathered coat, allowing strangers to dismiss him with little more than a passing glance. Never once had anyone stepped toward him with respect. Never once had anyone offered him a place beside them instead of sending him away. Yet this woman had done so before an entire room filled with society's most influential families. Harrison Wycliffe had spent the last 3 months living beneath another name. He had abandoned fine coats, polished boots, and every visible sign of rank to investigate why shipments of food, coal, and medicine purchased with his own fortune continued disappearing before reaching the struggling farming communities scattered throughout the Hudson Valley. Every trail eventually circled back toward Bellamy lands and the business dealings surrounding Lord Malcolm Sterling. That investigation had demanded distance, silence, and complete anonymity. Marriage had never belonged anywhere within his carefully measured plans. Lady Beatrice finally found her voice. "Audrey," she said, each word carefully restrained. "Come back inside immediately." Audrey did not move. Raindrops clung to loose strands of chestnut hair framing her face while the cold autumn wind pulled gently at the sleeves of her gown. "No." The answer arrived quietly, but it carried a certainty that surprised even her. Malcolm stepped forward beneath the protection of a servant's umbrella. "Miss Bellamy," he began with practiced patience, "surely this misunderstanding has gone far enough. You have made your point." Audrey met his gaze without flinching. "I have not begun to make my point." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others watched with growing fascination. Society adored scandal almost as much as it adored respectability. Lady Beatrice's voice became sharper. "That man is nothing more than a beggar standing outside my gate." Caleb slowly lifted his eyes toward her. There was neither anger nor humiliation within them. Only stillness. Harrison had long ago learned that outrage often revealed more than silence. Audrey turned toward the stranger beside her. "Is that true?" Caleb answered honestly, though not completely. "I own very little that can be seen." The words settled strangely over the gathering. He had not claimed wealth. Neither had he claimed poverty. Lady Beatrice laughed once, a short, brittle sound. "You hear him yourself." Audrey continued studying Caleb. His coat was worn. His boots carried dried mud from countless miles of travel. Rain soaked the edges of his collar. Yet his posture remained effortlessly straight despite the weight of exhaustion that should have bent his shoulders. His hands bore calluses earned through honest work, but every movement possessed unusual restraint, almost as though discipline had become instinct many years before. She remembered something her late father had once told her while teaching her how to recognize character rather than appearance. A person's dignity often survives long after fortune disappears. Malcolm stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away from Caleb. "Do you understand what she is proposing?" Caleb looked directly at him. "I do. And you would accept such madness?" Another pause followed. Harrison felt every careful plan slipping beyond recovery. If he refused, Audrey would almost certainly be forced into the marriage she feared. If he accepted, he would bind an innocent woman to a dangerous investigation built upon deception she could not possibly deserve. For the first time since beginning his disguise, uncertainty entered his thoughts. Then he noticed Audrey's hands. They were trembling slightly from the cold, yet she kept them folded calmly before her so no one else would notice. She was frightened. She simply refused to surrender because of that fear. Something within him quietly shifted. He looked toward Audrey instead of Malcolm. "If your offer is freely given," he said softly, "then I accept it." Audible gasps swept across the courtyard. Lady Beatrice closed her eyes for one brief moment before opening them again with renewed resolve. "This absurdity ends now." "No," Audrey answered before anyone else could speak. "It begins now." Thunder rolled once more across the dark sky. At that exact moment a black carriage appeared through the rain at the far end of the road leading toward the estate. Its polished doors displayed no family crest, yet Harrison recognized the careful craftsmanship immediately. Silas Mercer had found him far sooner than expected. The carriage slowed before reaching the entrance, remaining hidden beyond the curtain of rain. No one among the gathering seemed to notice it waiting silently in the distance. Harrison did. He also knew exactly why it had come. Mercer would never interrupt unless the missing relief funds had finally uncovered a truth that could change everything. Morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by the night's relentless rain, leaving the Hudson Valley wrapped in pale silver mist that drifted across the fields like quiet memories refusing to disappear. The small stone chapel overlooking the river had never hosted the marriage of anyone important. Its wooden pews bore the marks of decades of ordinary families, and the single brass bell above the entrance rang with a gentle humility that seemed almost forgotten by the grand estates scattered across the countryside. Audrey Bellamy stood beside the chapel door wearing the same ivory gown from the evening before, now carefully dried by the minister's wife and pressed as neatly as time allowed. She wore no jewels. The pearl necklace that had belonged to generations of Bellamy women remained locked inside her mother's estate. Around her neck rested only a narrow blue ribbon that her father had once tied there on her 12th birthday, telling her that courage never needed diamonds to be recognized. Nora Finch quietly adjusted the folds of Audrey's sleeves before stepping back with moist eyes. "You still have time to change your mind," she whispered. Audrey offered a gentle smile. "If I leave now, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether I abandoned the only decision that was truly mine." Inside the chapel, Caleb Rowan waited near the simple wooden altar. His borrowed dark jacket fit imperfectly across his shoulders, and his boots had been carefully cleaned although years of travel had left permanent scars in the leather. He looked every bit the ordinary traveler the world believed him to be. Yet when he stood in silence beneath the morning light pouring through the stained glass windows, there remained an unmistakable composure that no disguise could fully conceal. Harrison Wycliffe had attended magnificent weddings beneath cathedral ceilings covered in gold leaf, surrounded by governors, senators, and families whose names carried generations of influence. None of those ceremonies had unsettled him. This one did. Every promise spoken today would bind an innocent woman to secrets she had never agreed to carry. The minister entered quietly, carrying a weathered Bible that had served the village for nearly 40 years. Only 5 witnesses occupied the chapel. Nora stood beside Audrey. 2 elderly church caretakers sat together in respectful silence. A local blacksmith who had repaired the chapel roof months earlier had agreed to sign the marriage register. The final witness arrived only moments before the ceremony began, an older gentleman wrapped in a dark traveling coat who introduced himself simply as Samuel Mercer, claiming he had known Caleb years earlier. Harrison recognized him immediately despite the plain clothing. Silas Mercer had changed everything except the unwavering discipline in his eyes. He offered no greeting beyond the slightest respectful nod that no one else noticed. The ceremony began with quiet simplicity. The minister spoke not of fortune or family alliances but of kindness, patience, honesty, and mutual respect. Audrey listened to every word with complete attention, as though each sentence carried more value than every promise ever spoken inside Bellamy Glasshouse estate. When the time came for personal vows, the minister invited Caleb to speak first. Harrison looked toward Audrey, and for one difficult moment the truth nearly escaped him. He wanted to tell her his real name. He wanted to confess why he had wandered through the valley dressed as a poor traveler. He wanted to explain that hidden beneath the plain jacket rested a signet ring carrying responsibilities larger than either of them could imagine. Instead, he spoke the only promise he knew he could keep without deception. "I cannot promise you wealth," he said quietly. "I cannot promise you certainty because the road ahead remains unknown even to me. But I promise that no fear, no pride, and no title will ever ask you to surrender your dignity. As long as I stand beside you, your voice will never be treated as something smaller than my own." Audrey felt unexpected warmth rise behind her eyes. No one had ever offered her such a promise. Not because it guaranteed comfort, but because it recognized something she had spent years defending inside herself. When her turn arrived, she looked directly into Caleb's calm gray eyes. "I do not know what tomorrow will bring," she answered softly. "Perhaps we will have little. Perhaps we will struggle. But I would rather build an honest life beside someone who sees me as a partner than live inside a mansion where my future belongs to everyone except me." The minister smiled gently before joining their hands. As Harrison slipped the simple silver band onto Audrey's finger, the edge of his sleeve lifted just enough for a fraction of a second. Samuel Mercer noticed the faint impression left by the heavy signet ring Harrison normally wore beneath his glove. Their eyes met. Mercer lowered his head almost imperceptibly, catching himself before habit could betray them. The minister completed the blessing, and the little chapel bell rang once across the quiet valley. Husband and wife stepped into the cool autumn sunlight together. Across the road, hidden behind rows of amber maple trees, a lone rider watched the chapel before turning his horse toward Bellamy Estate with urgent purpose. By sunset, someone determined to separate them forever would know that Audrey Bellamy had truly become Mrs. Caleb Rowan. The narrow road leading away from the village chapel disappeared beneath towering maples whose leaves drifted across the damp ground like faded pieces of amber glass. Audrey sat quietly beside Caleb on the modest wooden wagon they had borrowed from a local farmer, her small traveling case resting between them while the cool October air carried the scent of pine, river water, and distant fireplaces preparing for another cold evening. Neither of them spoke very often during the journey. It was not an uncomfortable silence but the careful silence of two strangers who had chosen to share a future before learning the ordinary details of one another's lives. Every few miles Caleb glanced toward the winding road behind them, his attention lingering just long enough for Audrey to notice. "Are you expecting someone?" she finally asked. He looked ahead again before answering. "Only hoping not to inconvenience anyone by lingering too long in one place." The reply sounded truthful, yet incomplete. Audrey accepted it without pressing further. Her father had once told her that trust was not built by demanding every answer on the first day. Sometimes trust began by allowing another person time to carry what they were not yet ready to set down. By late afternoon they reached Rowan Hollow, where the forest opened into a quiet valley carved by a narrow stream whose clear water rushed beneath the weathered wheel of an old stone mill. Moss climbed the gray walls. Ivy wrapped itself around broken shutters. The wooden water wheel still turned slowly with the current, producing a soft rhythm that echoed through the surrounding pines. It was far humbler than Bellamy Glasshouse Estate, yet nothing about the place felt abandoned. Firewood had been neatly stacked beneath a covered shed. The stone path had recently been swept. Window panes, though old, had been carefully cleaned. Someone had been maintaining the property with patient hands. Audrey stepped down from the wagon and smiled gently. "It is beautiful." Caleb seemed almost surprised by her answer. "Most people would call it forgotten." She looked toward the stream reflecting the fading afternoon light. "Forgotten things can still become home." Her words settled quietly between them. Inside, the mill house contained only a handful of rooms. A sturdy oak table stood near a brick fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, holding a small collection of well-used books beside simple pottery bowls. A cast-iron stove occupied the kitchen corner, while a narrow staircase disappeared toward two modest bedrooms beneath the sloping roof. Everything was clean, orderly, and remarkably practical. Audrey removed her gloves and immediately began opening the windows to let fresh air inside. She folded blankets, dusted shelves, and placed wild autumn branches into an empty stone pitcher before setting it in the center of the table. Within an hour the quiet mill house already felt warmer. Caleb watched without interrupting. He had expected disappointment, perhaps even regret. Instead, Audrey moved through every room with calm purpose, treating the humble house with the same care she once offered the grand halls of her childhood. As evening approached, she tied an apron around her waist. "I suppose our first supper should not be burned." Caleb smiled faintly. "An excellent goal." She opened the small pantry and examined their supplies. Cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, apples, flour. Enough to prepare something simple. "Would you bring in another armful of firewood?" she asked. "Of course." Caleb walked outside, grateful for the task because it spared him from revealing an embarrassing truth. Harrison Wycliffe had negotiated railroad contracts, managed thousands of acres, and debated legislation with influential men across New York. Yet, he had almost no experience preparing a stove for an ordinary evening meal. Servants had quietly handled such details throughout his life. When he returned carrying neatly stacked logs, Audrey was kneeling before the stove, patiently arranging kindling. "Would you hand me the matches?" she asked. Caleb hesitated for the briefest moment before searching the wrong shelf entirely. Audrey looked up, puzzled. "They are hanging beside the flour bin." "Of course," he answered with a quiet laugh at himself. She noticed the hesitation but said nothing. A little later she handed him a worn iron skillet. "Could you grease the pan?" Caleb studied it as though measuring an unfamiliar instrument. Audrey gently reached over, took the skillet back with a warm smile, and demonstrated without the slightest hint of criticism. "Like this." He watched carefully. "I see. You have not spent much time cooking. That is becoming painfully obvious." She laughed softly, and the sound filled the old mill more completely than the fire beginning to crackle inside the stove. It was the first genuine laughter either of them had shared since meeting beneath the rain outside Bellamy Estate. After supper they sat beside the fireplace while darkness gathered beyond the windows. The water wheel continued its steady turning outside, keeping quiet time with the flowing stream. Audrey noticed a leather-bound book resting on the shelf nearest Caleb's chair. She reached for it absent-mindedly before pausing. The title was written entirely in elegant French. "You read French?" she asked with innocent curiosity. Caleb answered before remembering that a wandering traveler probably should not. "A little." Audrey slowly opened the volume, studying the graceful handwritten notes, filling the margins. They were not the careful practice of someone learning a language. They belonged to a man educated by excellent tutors. She closed the book gently, and looked toward the husband she barely knew. The firelight softened the lines of his weathered face, but it could not hide the unmistakable refinement that slipped through every careful disguise whenever he forgot to pretend. 3 quiet mornings passed beneath the whisper of turning water before Audrey realized that peace carried its own unfamiliar weight. The old mill greeted each sunrise with the steady murmur of the creek slipping beneath the weathered wheel, while pale autumn light filtered through tall pines and settled across the kitchen floor in long golden ribbons. The rhythm of their new life arrived without ceremony. Audrey swept the stone entry before breakfast, baked coarse bread from the remaining flour, gathered apples from a neglected orchard behind the mill, and learned which loose floorboards sang beneath careful footsteps. Caleb disappeared for several hours each afternoon, always returning before dusk with bundles of firewood, fresh vegetables purchased from distant farms, or small repairs completed somewhere in the valley. He never explained where he had been, and Audrey chose not to ask. She had promised herself that trust would be planted before suspicion, even if both needed time to grow. On the 4th morning a timid knock interrupted the quiet. Audrey opened the door to find a young mother wrapped in a faded wool shawl, holding the hand of a little boy whose cheeks had lost the healthy color every child deserved. Behind them stood an elderly grandfather with lowered eyes and an empty burlap sack folded beneath one arm. "Forgive the interruption," the older man said softly. Someone told us a traveler had settled here. We hoped perhaps you knew where work could be found. Audrey welcomed them inside before they finished speaking. The warmth from the stove slowly returned color to the child's face while she poured the last of the warm apple cider into 3 simple cups. Caleb watched silently from across the room. He recognized the family. They lived on land managed by Amos Crowley, the same estate supervisor whose ledgers had appeared repeatedly throughout his investigation into the missing relief shipments. The old man's boots were splitting along the seams. The mother's hands were rough from harvesting fields that barely fed her own family. None of them complained. They simply apologized for arriving uninvited. Audrey listened as they explained that several neighboring farms had lost expected deliveries of coal and medicine before the first cold nights of autumn. Rent had increased even while promised assistance had never arrived. She glanced toward the nearly empty pantry without allowing disappointment to reach her face. There remained only 1 loaf of bread, a small bag of beans, several apples, and enough salt pork for perhaps 2 modest meals. She carried every bit of it to the table without hesitation. "Please take these," she said. The older man immediately shook his head. "Ma'am, you and your husband need this more than we do." Audrey smiled gently. "Today you need it first." Caleb remained motionless. He had spent months studying financial records, interviewing merchants, tracing forged signatures, and searching for evidence that could expose those responsible for stealing aid from struggling families. Yet no document had ever revealed what stood before him now. Audrey believed she had married a man with almost nothing. She believed every meal they shared had to be carefully measured. Still, she never calculated whether generosity was affordable. She simply offered it because another family needed it more. After the visitors finally departed, carrying the small bundle with grateful hands, Audrey stood quietly beside the empty pantry. She reached into the pocket of her dress and removed the last valuable possession she had brought from Bellamy Estate. It was a delicate silver hairpin shaped like a climbing rose, the only keepsake remaining from her grandmother. She turned it once beneath the morning light before placing it gently into Caleb's hand. "Would you take this into town tomorrow?" she asked. "It should bring enough money for medicine if that little boy becomes worse." Harrison stared at the heirloom resting against his palm. The piece was worth far more than Audrey realized, not because of the silver but because it represented the final thread connecting her to the family home she had willingly left behind. "You may wish to keep it," he said quietly. Audrey closed his fingers around it. "Memories do not disappear because an object does." Her answer settled deeply inside him. Long after she returned to washing dishes, Harrison stepped outside carrying the hairpin. The cool wind swept through the pines while the creek continued its endless song beneath the turning wheel. He did not walk toward town. Instead, he followed a narrow trail leading into the forest where a dark carriage waited beneath towering hemlocks almost perfectly hidden by the trees. Silas Mercer stepped down the moment he saw him. Harrison placed the silver hairpin into his trusted steward's hand. "Sell nothing," he instructed. "Return this exactly as it is." Mercer nodded once. "And the family?" Harrison looked back toward the distant mill where Audrey's silhouette moved gently across the kitchen window. "Deliver food, coal, blankets, and medicine to every household Crowley has neglected. Leave no name. Accept no gratitude. If anyone asks, tell them only that kindness reached them before winter did." Mercer studied him for a long moment before speaking carefully. "She still believes you have nothing." Harrison's gaze never left the little stone mill glowing softly beneath the afternoon sun. "That is exactly why I cannot allow her kindness to become her burden." As Mercer prepared the carriage to disappear once more into the forest, either man noticed the lone rider watching from the opposite ridge, quietly observing every movement before turning his horse toward Bellamy Estate with dangerous purpose. The first frost arrived quietly, covering the grass around Rowan Hollow with a silver veil that disappeared beneath the gentle warmth of the morning sun. Smoke rose from the chimney of the old mill house in soft gray ribbons while the creek continued its endless conversation with the weathered water wheel. Audrey had begun measuring time not by calendars but by simple routines. The kettle sang before sunrise. Fresh bread cooled beside the window each afternoon. Every evening she and Caleb shared supper beneath the glow of a single oil lamp, their conversations growing a little longer with each passing day. They still knew surprisingly little about one another, yet the spaces between their words no longer felt empty. They felt peaceful. That afternoon the roof above the storage room demanded attention after several loose shingles surrendered to the changing season. Caleb carried a wooden ladder toward the back of the mill, while Audrey followed with a basket filled with nails, a hammer, and strips of canvas. "You have done this before?" she asked. Caleb smiled faintly. "Not nearly as often as I should have." She laughed softly. "Then today we both learn." They climbed carefully into the cool autumn sunlight where the worn shingles overlooked miles of crimson and gold forests stretching toward the Hudson River. Fallen leaves drifted through the crisp air while distant church bells echoed from a village hidden beyond the hills. Audrey knelt near the damaged section, securing fresh canvas beneath the loose boards with patient hands. Caleb worked beside her, passing nails and lifting weathered planks into place. For a little while either spoke. The quiet itself became its own conversation. As Audrey reached farther across the roof, one of the old boards shifted beneath her weight. She instinctively reached for balance, but the smooth wood offered little support. Before fear could fully reach her, Caleb caught her wrist with one hand and steadied her shoulder with the other. She found herself only inches away from him, her heart beat louder than the turning water below. Neither moved immediately. Autumn sunlight rested across his face, softening the lines carved there by years she could only imagine. His gray eyes held concern rather than alarm, as though protecting someone had become second nature long before they met. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Audrey shook her head. "No. Only startled." He released her slowly, careful that she had regained her balance before letting his hand fall away. She looked at him for another moment before smiling with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." "Always," he answered without thinking. The single word lingered between them long after the roof had been repaired. Later that evening they sat outside the mill wrapped in wool blankets, watching the last light fade behind the trees while warm apple cider steamed gently between their hands. The cool air carried the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke. Audrey watched the stars begin appearing one by one above the valley. "May I ask you something?" Caleb nodded. "Anything." She hesitated only briefly. "Do you regret saying yes that day outside my mother's estate?" Harrison felt the question settle heavily inside him. Every instinct urged him to answer honestly, yet honesty itself had become complicated. "No," he replied at last. "I regret only that I cannot give you the life you deserved." Audrey looked toward the dark creek reflecting scattered stars. "Perhaps you misunderstand what I wanted." He remained silent. "Everyone believed I needed wealth," she continued. "But wealth was never the thing missing from my life. Choice was." Harrison lowered his eyes. Every word deepened the quiet burden resting upon his conscience. She believed she had finally found a man who accepted her without conditions, while the greatest condition of all remained hidden behind the name Caleb Rowan. Before he could answer, the peaceful evening shattered beneath the sharp crack of breaking glass. One of the small windows beside the kitchen table splintered inward as a smooth river stone rolled across the wooden floor. Audrey stood immediately, startled but unharmed. Caleb crossed the room within seconds and picked up the stone. A folded piece of paper had been tied securely around it with rough twine. He untied it carefully, and unfolded the single sentence written in hurried block letters. "Stop asking about the missing funds." Audrey stared at the message in confusion. "What does that mean?" Harrison remained still, reading the words again even though he already understood them perfectly. Someone knew he had continued his investigation despite months of careful secrecy. Someone had followed the trail all the way to Rowan Hollow. Audrey searched his face, seeing something she had never witnessed before. It was not fear. It was recognition. "Caleb," she whispered gently. "Who are they talking about?" He looked into her trusting eyes, knowing that one truthful answer would unravel every carefully guarded lie that had brought him to her door. Yet before he could speak, Hoofbeats echoed across the distant road beyond the trees, slow, deliberate, and drawing steadily closer to the quiet mill where secrets were running out of places to hide. The hoofbeats grew louder until 3 riders emerged from the mist covering the narrow road leading into Rowan Hollow. Their horses slowed before the old stone mill, and the man riding at the front removed his hat with measured courtesy. Audrey immediately recognized her mother sitting inside the elegant carriage that followed close behind. Lady Beatrice Bellamy had not come alone. Lord Malcolm Sterling stepped down beside her, his polished boots untouched by the damp earth while his dark coat looked as immaculate as it had during the abandoned engagement celebration. Behind them stood a local magistrate carrying a leather case filled with official papers. The peaceful valley suddenly felt much smaller. Audrey instinctively moved closer to Caleb, not out of fear, but because standing beside him had begun to feel like the most natural place in the world. Lady Beatrice's eyes swept across the modest mill, lingering on the patched roof, the neatly stacked firewood, and the small vegetable garden. Audrey had already begun preparing for spring. "So this is where you have chosen to throw your life away," she said quietly. Audrey answered with calm dignity. "I have chosen where to begin it." Malcolm smiled, although warmth never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Rowan, no one wishes to embarrass you. We are here to correct a mistake before it becomes permanent." Caleb remained silent, allowing Audrey every opportunity to answer for herself. She folded her hands before her. "There is no mistake." The magistrate cleared his throat politely. "Ma'am, concerns have been raised regarding your husband's identity and legal residence. Certain records cannot be verified." Harrison felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. His investigation had already disturbed powerful interests. Someone had clearly begun using that uncertainty against him. Lady Beatrice stepped forward. "This man appeared without history, without references, without property, and without any respectable witness except a stranger who vanished immediately after your wedding. Audrey, come home. This humiliation can still be forgotten." Audrey looked toward the old mill before answering. Sunlight rested across the stone walls she had cleaned with her own hands. Smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney. The small home held almost nothing of material value, yet every corner carried honest effort instead of quiet control. "Home," she said softly, "is the first place where I have been allowed to choose my own future." Her mother's expression hardened. Malcolm took another careful step forward. "You deserve comfort, security, and respect. Return with us, and everything will be restored." Audrey slowly turned toward him. "Respect cannot be restored where it never existed." Silence settled across the clearing. Even the horses stood quietly beneath the towering pines. Malcolm's polished confidence slipped for only an instant before returning behind another practiced smile. "You speak this way because he has deceived you." Audrey glanced toward Caleb. She knew there were questions surrounding him. She knew his education, his manners, his knowledge of languages, and the mysterious warning delivered only the night before pointed toward truths he had not shared. Yet she also remembered every simple kindness he had offered without asking anything in return. He had never spoken over her, never dismissed her thoughts, never treated her independence as a threat. Whatever secret he carried, those moments had been real. "Perhaps he has hidden something," Audrey admitted gently. "But hiding pain is not the same as lacking honor." Harrison lowered his eyes. Her trust became more difficult to bear with every passing day. Lady Beatrice extended one final offer. "If you leave now, I will pretend this marriage never happened." Audrey shook her head. "It happened the moment I gave my word." Malcolm's patience finally began to crack. "Then understand the consequences." He motioned toward the magistrate, who reluctantly opened the leather case. Before a single document could be removed, a distant rumble echoed through the valley. It was not thunder. It was the unmistakable sound of several horses approaching at a steady, disciplined pace. Everyone turned toward the forest road. A line of mounted riders emerged between the autumn trees, each dressed in dark traveling coats, their formation orderly despite the rough terrain. At their head rode an older gentleman whose silver hair caught the afternoon light. He dismounted before anyone else, removed his gloves, and walked directly toward Caleb. Harrison's heartbeat slowed. He had hoped for one more day before this moment arrived. The older gentleman stopped only a few feet away. Without hesitation, he bowed his head with quiet respect that no ordinary servant would ever mistake. Audrey watched in complete silence as the man spoke words that transformed the peaceful clearing into the edge of an entirely different world. "Sir," he said carefully, "I have found the evidence you requested. We no longer have time to remain hidden." Lady Beatrice frowned in confusion. Malcolm's expression stiffened. Audrey looked from the distinguished stranger back to the man she knew as Caleb Rowan, suddenly realizing that everyone standing before her seemed to understand something she did not, and for the first time since their wedding, she wondered whether the greatest distance between two people could exist even while they stood side by side. The autumn wind moved through Rowan Hollow with unusual stillness, as though even the ancient pines understood that one quiet sentence could change every life gathered before the old mill. Audrey stood frozen beside Caleb while the distinguished gentleman remained respectfully bowed, his gloved hands folded before him with the practiced discipline of a lifelong steward. Lady Beatrice looked from one unfamiliar face to another, unable to understand why a man dressed with such refinement would lower himself before someone she believed to be an ordinary traveler. Lord Malcolm Sterling, however, had stopped smiling altogether. He recognized disciplined loyalty when he saw it. Caleb closed his eyes for the briefest moment before speaking. "Thank you, Mercer." The familiar name escaped his lips almost as a whisper. Audrey remembered hearing it once before during the quiet night when she had awakened to distant voices beyond the mill. At the time she had convinced herself she must have misunderstood. Now the pieces of forgotten moments slowly began drifting together. The French book. The careful handwriting. The effortless posture. The strangers who seemed to obey invisible instructions. The unexplained deliveries that had quietly reached hungry families. None of those moments had made sense by themselves. Together they formed a truth standing silently beside her. Mercer reached inside his coat and carefully removed a leather portfolio sealed with dark green wax. "The missing records have been recovered," he said calmly. "Every altered ledger, every forged receipt, and every shipment diverted from the valley has been accounted for." He extended the portfolio toward Caleb with both hands. Harrison accepted it slowly, knowing that once he opened those papers there would be no returning to the simple life Audrey believed they shared. Malcolm stepped forward before the seal could be broken. "Who exactly are you?" he demanded, unable to disguise the uneasiness creeping into his voice. Caleb looked at him for a long moment before answering. His shoulders remained relaxed, yet something within his bearing quietly changed. It was not arrogance. It was the effortless confidence of a man who no longer needed to pretend to be smaller than he truly was. "My name," he said at last, "is Harrison Wycliffe." The valley became perfectly silent. Lady Beatrice frowned, searching her memory. Then recognition slowly drained the color from her face. Everyone throughout New York knew the Wycliffe name. It belonged to one of the oldest and most respected noble families whose estates stretched across thousands of acres above the Hudson River. Audrey looked at the man beside her, as though she had never seen him before. Harrison continued quietly. "I came to this valley under another name because relief shipments purchased for local families had been disappearing before reaching those who needed them. I could not investigate honestly while wearing a title that warned every dishonest man to hide his tracks." Mercer bowed his head once more before speaking the words he had spent weeks carefully avoiding. "Your Grace, every document is now ready for your review." Audrey's breath caught. She did not react with disbelief because every strange detail she had quietly noticed now found its place. The careful manners. The education. The restraint. The unexplained respect shown by strangers. They had never belonged to Caleb Rowan. They had always belonged to Duke Harrison Wycliffe. Lady Beatrice stepped backward, suddenly uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Malcolm attempted to recover his confidence. "Titles prove nothing," Harrison calmly untied the leather portfolio and handed several ledgers to the local magistrate. Please compare these shipping records with those filed at the county office. The magistrate examined the papers carefully, turning several pages before looking toward Malcolm with visible concern. These signatures do not match the official copies. Harrison nodded. Because the official copies were altered after the supplies disappeared. More riders quietly approached, carrying wooden crates marked with the charitable foundation Harrison had established years earlier. Mercer opened one crate, revealing blankets, medicine, preserved food, and coal vouchers that had never reached the valley. Every shipment intended for these communities was redirected through companies controlled by Amos Crowley. Harrison explained. The profits were hidden through false rental accounts and fraudulent transportation fees. Malcolm's composure finally began to crumble. You cannot prove I ordered any of this. Harrison met his eyes steadily. The correspondence found this morning says otherwise. He removed several letters bearing Malcolm's personal seal and handed them to the magistrate without another word. No raised voice was necessary. Truth carried its own authority. Yet none of those revelations reached Audrey as deeply as the quiet realization standing before her. The man she had defended, trusted, and married had never truly existed. Caleb Rowan had been a borrowed name, a carefully constructed disguise, and every precious memory they had shared now stood balanced between honesty and deception. Slowly, almost absent-mindedly, she looked down at the simple silver wedding band resting upon her finger. Harrison noticed the movement immediately. Of every fear he had carried during the past weeks, this had always been the greatest. Not losing his investigation. Not losing his title. Losing the trust of the woman who had chosen him when she believed he possessed absolutely nothing. Audrey gently slipped the ring from her finger and held it carefully within her palm. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and there was no anger in them, only a quiet sorrow that hurt far more than accusation ever could. I never cared that you were poor, she said softly. I only wanted to know who my husband truly was. Harrison searched for an answer worthy of the moment, but every explanation felt painfully small beside the simple truth that mattered most. Before he could speak, Audrey turned away from the gathering and began walking slowly toward the little stone bridge crossing the creek, leaving the silver ring resting silently in her trembling hand while the man who had finally reclaimed his true name realized he might already have lost the one person whose forgiveness could never be commanded by rank, wealth, or power. The creek continued its quiet journey beneath the old stone bridge as afternoon slowly surrendered to evening, carrying golden leaves across the gentle current without asking where they wished to go. Audrey stood alone at the center of the bridge, her fingers wrapped around the simple silver wedding band while the last light of the day shimmered across the water below. Behind her, voices rose and faded as the magistrate carefully examined every ledger Harrison had uncovered. The evidence spoke with calm certainty. The stolen shipments, the altered records, and the hidden profits all revealed the same pattern of deception that had burdened the valley for months. Orders were quietly given for the documents to be secured, and the families whose names had been buried beneath dishonest accounts would finally receive the assistance promised to them before winter arrived. Yet none of those victories eased the ache within Audrey's heart. She had married a man believing she knew exactly who he was. Now she wondered whether the happiest moments they had shared had belonged to a stranger whose name had never truly existed. Harrison waited until every official matter had been settled before walking toward the bridge alone. He had removed the dark riding coat Mercer had brought for him and folded it over one arm. The polished signet ring bearing the Wycliffe crest remained tucked inside his pocket instead of resting upon his hand. He stopped several feet away, allowing silence to speak before either of them did. You deserve the truth, he said quietly. Audrey did not immediately turn around. I deserved it before I married you. Harrison lowered his eyes. You are right. There was no excuse hidden inside the simple admission. No attempt to soften what he had done. When I came here, I believed wearing another name was the only way to discover who had been stealing from families that depended upon those supplies. Every dishonest door would have closed the moment they recognized the Duke of Wycliffe. Then I met you, and everything I had carefully planned became far more complicated than I imagined. Audrey slowly faced him. The fading sunlight reflected gently in her eyes, carrying sadness but not bitterness. You could have told me after the wedding. I wanted to. Harrison answered honestly. Every day became harder than the one before because every kindness you showed me reminded me that you trusted a man who did not fully exist. I feared losing your trust. In trying to protect it, I betrayed it instead. Audrey looked down at the wedding band resting in her palm. The strange thing is that I do not miss the title I never knew about. Her voice remained calm. I miss believing there were no secrets standing between us. Harrison took one careful step closer. Then allow me to begin again without any. He reached into his pocket and placed the Wycliffe signet ring upon the stone railing beside them instead of putting it on his own hand. This ring represents every privilege I inherited before I earned any of it. But the happiest weeks of my life were spent splitting firewood, repairing a roof badly, burning supper because I did not know how to light a stove properly, and listening to you laugh inside that little mill. A faint smile appeared despite Audrey's lingering tears. You truly were terrible with the stove. Harrison smiled for the first time since revealing his name. Unquestionably. The quiet laughter that followed felt small, yet it carried the first fragile thread of healing. Several days later, after the official investigation had concluded and the stolen supplies had finally reached every family waiting throughout the valley, Audrey made one final journey to Bellamy Glasshouse Estate. The once magnificent conservatory stood beneath the clear autumn sky, its cracked panes catching sunlight that seemed brighter than she remembered. Lady Beatrice met her daughter inside the silent greenhouse, where roses had long since stopped blooming. For the first time in many years, there were no commands waiting behind her mother's eyes. Only regret. I wanted to save our family, Lady Beatrice whispered. Audrey gently took her mother's hand. Then let us build one worth saving. There were no dramatic speeches after that day. No celebrations filled with wealthy guests. Instead, Harrison quietly funded the restoration of the Bellamy greenhouses, not as a gift of charity but as Audrey's own project. She reopened the gardens the following spring, hiring widows, struggling mothers, and families who had nearly lost everything during the difficult season. Flowers once again filled the glasshouse with color, while children laughed among paths that had stood empty for years. Harrison often visited wearing the same plain brown coat he had first worn beneath the old elm tree outside the estate gates. One cool afternoon he found Audrey tending newly planted climbing roses beneath the restored glass roof. Without ceremony he knelt before her, not as a duke surrounded by servants, but simply as the man who had once answered to the name Caleb Rowan. He held out the silver wedding band she had returned weeks earlier. You chose me when you believed I owned nothing, he said softly. May I ask you to choose me again, now that I have nothing left to hide? Audrey looked into his familiar gray eyes and saw no disguise waiting behind them, only honesty earned through humility. She slipped the ring back onto her finger before gently placing the Wycliffe signet ring into Harrison's hand. Keep your title, she said with a warm smile. But never hide your heart from me again. Sunlight poured through the restored glass ceiling, warming the roses that climbed steadily toward the light, while beyond the greenhouse windows the Hudson Valley welcomed another spring. Some people believe love is discovered through fortune, power, or perfect timing. Yet the truest kind often begins the moment two wounded hearts finally stop pretending to be someone else.